Hello there, my gentle dreamers. Tonight, we return to the shadows of twilight, beyond the sparkle of vampires, into the deep breath of the forest. This is the other side of the story, where the howls echo and the ground trembles with every step of the Quileute walls. We're diving into their story, from the ancient legends that shaped them, to the battles that defined them, and the bonds that held their pack together through the chaos of the Twilight saga. So, close your eyes, breathe in very slowly, feel the forest come alive around you, and follow the sound of the wolves into a world where brotherhood runs deeper than blood, and where the night is never silent. In the time before memory became written word, before the world had been mapped and measured and divided into nations with borders, the Quileute people lived where they had always lived. On the northwestern edge of the continent, in that thin margin where ancient forests met endless ocean, where the land itself seemed uncertain whether it belonged to earth or sea. The territory was small, pressed between towering trees and crashing waves, but it was theirs. It had always been theirs. The forest was dense in a way that forests in other places could never be, fed by constant moisture from clouds that seemed permanently settled over this corner of the world. Cedar and spruce and hemlock grew so thick that walking through them required pathways carved deliberately, or else the green would reclaim everything with patient inevitability. The ocean was grey more often than blue, its waters cold enough to kill in minutes, but it provided, as it always had. Salmon ran in the rivers, seals basked on offshore rocks, whales passed during their migrations, massive and ancient. The Quileutes were not numerous, had never been numerous. Other tribes had spread across the continent in great numbers, had built cities and confederations. But the Quileutes remained small. A tight community bound by blood and proximity, and the simple fact of survival in a place that was beautiful and harsh in equal measure. Small meant vulnerable, meant that every person mattered. But small also meant special. Small meant that when the spirits looked down and decided which people would be given gifts beyond the ordinary scope of human existence, they chose the Quileutes. The chief in those ancient days was named Taha Aki, and he was, by all accounts and all legends, the greatest leader the tribe had ever known. Taha Aki was a warrior, skilled with the weapons of his time, able to defend his people when defense was required. But his true gift was something else entirely. Taha Aki was a spirit warrior, one of a line of chiefs who possessed the ability to leave their physical bodies behind and walk the world as pure consciousness. The magic was old, passed down through the chiefly bloodline, though not every chief possessed it. When it did appear, the power was immense. A spirit warrior could travel vast distances in moments, could pass through solid matter, could observe without being observed. Taha Aki used this gift as it was meant to be used, in the quiet hours, he would settle his body somewhere safe and let his spirit rise. He would range across tribal lands, watching for threats, raiders from neighboring tribes, predators that came too close to the village, natural dangers that might harm the unwary. The tribe prospered under his leadership. Years passed in relative peace, the kind that allowed children to grow numerous, that allowed the elderly to reach truly old age. Taha Aki was loved, deeply and genuinely, in the way that good leaders are loved when their people recognize that safety is not accident but the result of constant sacrifice. But there was one man who did not love Taha Aki. One man who saw the chief's power and felt not gratitude but envy. His name was Utlapa, and he was also a spirit warrior, another man of the chiefly line who possessed the gift. But where Taha Aki used his power for protection, Utlapa dreamed of conquest. He wanted to lead the tribe to war, to expand their territory, to build an empire. Taha Aki refused these ambitions, counseled peace, argued that the tribe's strength lay in unity and wisdom, not in aggression. Utlapa's resentment grew, festered, became poison. And in that poisoned state, he conceived a plan of terrible brilliance. He waited until Taha Aki ranged far from the village in spirit form, traveling to the distant edges of their territory. Utlapa followed, invisible to Taha Aki's awareness, trailing like a shadow. And when Taha Aki's spirit was sufficiently far from his hidden body, Utlapa struck. He returned to the secret place where Taha Aki had left his physical form. The chief's body lay in a hidden cave, breathing slowly in the stillness of spirit walking. Utlapa could have killed it easily, but he wanted more than murder. He wanted everything. So instead of killing Taha Aki's body, Utlapa entered it, claimed it, stole it. A spirit warrior's body, when emptied of its rightful spirit, was vulnerable in ways the legends had never articulated. Utlapa slipped into Taha Aki's flesh like a hand into a glove. He stood in the stolen body, felt its strength, its authority, and then he took a knife and cut his own body's throat, destroyed his original form so that he could never be forced to return to it. Taha Aki, ranging far in spirit form, felt the moment his body was taken. The connection between spirit and flesh was severed, and the sensation was agony beyond anything physical pain could match. He raced back, desperate and disbelieving, and found Utlapa standing in his body, his original body dead and bleeding on the cave floor. The betrayal was complete. Taha Aki's spirit raged and wept, but he was powerless. A spirit without a body cannot touch the physical world, cannot speak, cannot act. He could only watch as Utlapa walked back to the village wearing Taha Aki's face. The false chief was clever. He moved carefully, changed things gradually. He began to argue for wars, began to poison the tribe's relationships with neighbors, began to transform the peaceful people into something harder. And the tribe, trusting their chief, began to follow. Taha Aki's spirit could do nothing but watch. He followed the false chief, screaming warnings no one could hear. Days became weeks. The tribe began to change, to become something Taha Aki no longer recognized. He wandered in despair, a consciousness without purpose, unable to affect the world, but unable to leave it. He was trapped in this existence that was neither life nor death, forced to witness everything he'd built being corrupted. But then, in his deepest moment of hopelessness, something changed. He was drifting near the village when he heard the cry of a wolf. The sound was familiar. Wolves were common in the forest, but this cry was different. This cry sounded like grief, like loneliness, like the wolf was calling for pack that would never answer. And in that sound, Taha Aki recognized himself, recognized the isolation, the helplessness, the desperate longing for connection that could never be fulfilled. His spirit reached out to the wolf, not consciously or with any plan, just with the simple desire to be close to something that understood pain. And in that reaching, in that moment of perfect empathy between the spirit chief and the lonely wolf, magic happened. Transformation is too small a word for what occurred. It was a rewriting of what was possible, what was real. Taha Aki's spirit did not enter the wolf's body the way Utlapa had stolen his. Instead, the spirit and the wolf merged, became something new, something that had never existed before. Taha Aki became a wolf, not a spirit possessing an animal, but truly and completely a wolf. Massive, far larger than any normal wolf, powerful beyond anything nature could produce. His fur was the deep black of a moonless night. His eyes held intelligence that no animal had ever possessed. And in his heart burned the love for his people that had always defined him. He ran. For the first time since losing his body, he could act, could move through the physical world with purpose and power. He ran toward the village, faster than any normal wolf could run. And as he approached, Taha Aki threw back his massive head and howled. The sound carried across the village like thunder, like prophecy. The false chief heard it and knew instantly that his time was ending. He fled, but there was nowhere far enough to run. Taha Aki pursued, tireless and furious, until he cornered Utlapa in the forest, where this had all begun. The battle was brief and brutal. Utlapa, in Taha Aki's stolen body, was strong, was skilled, but he was merely human. And Taha Aki was no longer human at all. The great wolf tore into the false chief, reclaimed his stolen flesh through violence, through the absolute justice of righteous fury. And when it was done, when Utlapa lay dead, Taha Aki's spirit finally let go of the wolf form. He expected to die then, expected that this had been his final act. But instead, he found himself standing on two legs again, human once more, naked and trembling in the forest clearing. The magic had not consumed him, but transformed him permanently, given him the ability to shift between forms, to be both man and wolf as needed. The gift that had been born from desperation and love was now his to keep, to use, to pass on. Taha Aki returned to his people, and they rejoiced. They had known somehow that the chief who'd been leading them was not their true leader, had felt the wrongness even if they couldn't articulate it. He explained everything, the betrayal and the transformation, the new gift that magic and love had created. And the tribe understood that they had been given something precious, something that would protect them for all the generations to come, because the gift did not end with Taha Aki. His sons, born after his transformation, carried the potential for the wolf within their blood. Not all of them, the magic was selective, appeared in some and skipped others, but enough, always enough. When danger threatened, when the tribe needed protectors, the wolf gift would emerge in those who carried Taha Aki's bloodline, would transform young men into massive wolves capable of defending against any threat. This was how it began. This was the origin of the protectors, the spirit warriors who ran on 4 legs instead of walking on 2, who gave up normal human existence to serve as guardians. The gift was a burden, and a blessing in equal measure. Power that came with sacrifice, strength that came with isolation. But it was necessary because the Quileutes were small and vulnerable, and the world was large and dangerous. Taha Aki led his people for many more years, aging slowly now that he carried the wolf spirit, watching his sons grow and some of them discover the gift in their own blood. He taught them control, taught them purpose, taught them that the wolf was not a curse, but a sacred responsibility. And when he finally died, ancient and honored, his legacy lived on in every descendant who would carry the gift. The legend of Taha Aki became the foundation story of the Quileutes, the explanation for why they were different, why they were special, why they endured when larger tribes had vanished. They were protected. They were loved by magic and by the sacrifice of those who became wolves. They were small, but they were mighty, because they had guardians who were more than human. And in the centuries that followed, whenever danger came to the Quileute lands, the wolves would rise. They always had. They always would. Because that was what the gift demanded, what the bloodline required, what love and duty and the memory of Taha Aki's transformation insisted upon. The protectors ran through the forest on 4 legs, massive and powerful, keeping watch in the darkness, standing between their people and anything that would harm them. The legend had become reality, had become biology, had become destiny written in blood and bone, and the fierce protective love that transcended death itself. This was the beginning. This was where the timeline of the Quileute wolves truly started, in that moment when a spirit chief merged with a lonely wolf and created something new, something that would echo through centuries, something that would define a people forever. Taha Aki's leadership stretched across many years, far more than any ordinary human life could contain. The wolf gift had changed him in ways beyond the obvious transformation between man and beast. He aged, but slowly, the years touching him with gentle hands rather than the harsh grip they laid on others. He watched children grow into adults, watched adults become elders, watched elders pass into death, and still he remained the constant guardian, the eternal chief. He married 3 times across that long existence. The first wife gave him daughters, strong girls who carried his blood, but not the wolf gift, which seemed to pass only through sons. She died in childbirth with their 4th child, a tragedy common enough in those days when bringing life into the world was always a dance with death. Taha Aki mourned her deeply, honored her memory, and eventually, after appropriate time had passed, took a second wife. The second wife bore him sons, and it was in these boys that the wolf gift first appeared in the next generation. They were young men when the transformation took them, sudden and violent and terrifying, until Taha Aki could explain, could teach them what they had become. These first inheritors of the gift became the original pack, running alongside their father, learning to hunt as wolves, learning to patrol the territory, learning to be protectors. The second wife understood what her sons had become, accepted it with the resignation of someone who knew that arguing with destiny was pointless. She grew old while Taha Aki remained young, and when she finally died, ancient and tired, Taha Aki mourned again. Years passed before he took a third wife. He was reluctant, aware now of the pattern, aware that he would outlive her as he had outlived the others. But loneliness was his own kind of death, and the tribe encouraged him, needed him to be whole. needed their chief to be connected to the human world and not lost entirely to the wolf. So he married again, and the third wife was young and kind and patient, with this man who was ancient in ways that had nothing to do with the relatively few lines on his face. The third wife gave him more sons, more carriers of the gift, expanding the number of protectors available to the tribe. The pack grew, became a proper force, organized and disciplined under Taha Aki's leadership. They were good years, peaceful years, the kind of time that let people forget that danger was always waiting somewhere beyond the firelight. But peace never lasts forever. Peace is always temporary, always borrowed time that must eventually be repaid. The cold woman came on a winter night when the wind howled like wolves, and the rain fell so hard it felt like stones against skin. She emerged from the forest as if the darkness itself had taken form, as if the storm had condensed into the shape of a woman and decided to walk. The wolf pack was patrolling, as they always did, ranging across the territory in their massive forms, and they encountered her at the northern boundary where the forest grew thickest. She was beautiful. That was the first thing they noticed. The thing that made them hesitate when instinct should have driven them to immediate attack. Beautiful in a way that seemed wrong somehow, too perfect, too symmetrical, like looking at something carved rather than born. Her skin was pale as snow, luminous in the darkness. Her eyes reflected what little light existed, flashing like an animal's eyes, but with colors no animal had ever possessed. She moved with grace that defied the mud and undergrowth, her feet barely seeming to touch the ground. And she was cold. Even from a distance, the wolves could sense it, a coldness that had nothing to do with the winter air, a coldness that emanated from her like heat from a fire, but in reverse. This was not the cold of weather or season. This was the cold of death, of something that should not be walking, should not be moving, should not be wearing the shape of a living woman. The pack surrounded her, 6 massive wolves forming a circle, cutting off escape, growling low in their chests. Taha Aki, largest and blackest, stepped forward, positioning himself between this strange woman and the direction of the village. Whatever she was, wherever she had come from, she would not pass, would not be allowed to threaten his people. The cold woman looked at the wolves with eyes that held no fear, only curiosity and something that might have been amusement. She spoke, her voice like wind through a crypt, and said words in a language none of them knew. Then she smiled, and her smile revealed teeth that were too sharp, too white. Teeth made for tearing rather than speaking. She moved faster than anything should be able to move. One moment she stood still, surrounded, apparently trapped. The next moment she was simply elsewhere, had crossed 10 feet in the space between heartbeats, faster than the wolves could track. She moved like water, like smoke, like something that existed outside the normal rules that governed flesh and bone. The battle began, and it was unlike anything the wolves had ever experienced. The pack had fought bears, had fought mountain lions, had fought raiders from other tribes. But this was different. The cold woman was stronger than anything her size should be. When she struck, wolves went flying, their massive forms tossed like they weighed nothing. When they bit her, their teeth scraped against skin that felt like stone, unyielding and impossibly hard. And when they managed to wound her, when claws or teeth found purchase, she bled, but the blood was wrong, was thick and slow and smelled like venom. She was a vampire, Though the wolves had no word for it yet, though the concept was foreign to their experience, they understood on some instinct level what she was. Dead but walking. A predator designed to hunt humans. An abomination against the natural order. Something that should not exist but did. The fight raged through the forest, trees splintering, earth churned into mud beneath their struggle. The cold woman laughed. Actually laughed. Like this was sport to her. Like the wolves were entertainment rather than threat. She was playing with them, testing her strength against theirs, enjoying the violence with the enthusiasm of something that had no fear of death, because death had already claimed her once. But the wolves were many, and she was one, and slowly, painfully, they began to wear her down. Taha Aki fought with the desperation of someone protecting everything he loved, fought with strategy born from decades of leadership, coordinating the pack through the mental link they shared in wolf form. They worked together, striking from multiple angles, giving her no chance to focus on a single opponent, driving her back step by step away from the direction of the village. Yet even as they fought, even as they slowly gained advantage, the terrible understanding grew among them. The cold woman was not trying her hardest. She was fighting, yes, but not with the desperate intensity of someone truly threatened. She was holding back, was treating this as a test, a measurement of what these strange giant wolves could do. And then, with suddenness that caught them all off guard, she broke through their circle. She simply chose a direction and went, moving with that impossible speed. And though the wolves pursued, though they ran faster than any normal wolf could run, she was faster still. She was heading toward the village, toward the vulnerable humans who had no defense against something like her. Terror drove the pack to greater speed. They ran with every ounce of strength they possessed, tearing through the forest, but the cold woman maintained her lead. She would reach the village before them, would reach the children, the elders, the women, everyone who trusted that the wolves would keep them safe. The weight of that failure was crushing, was unbearable. But the third wife was in the village. Taha Aki's young wife, who had been preparing a meal, who had been going about the normal, peaceful activities of normal, peaceful life. She heard the commotion approaching, heard the crashing through the forest that meant something large and fast was coming. She stepped out of the dwelling to investigate, to understand the danger, and saw the cold woman emerge from the trees. The vampire's eyes fixed on her, red eyes that promised death, and the cold woman smiled that terrible smile and changed direction. Here was prey, here was warm blood and beating heart, here was everything a vampire desired. She moved toward the third wife with purpose, with hunger finally showing through the playful facade she'd maintained during the fight. The third wife understood in that instant what was happening, what this creature was, what it intended. She could see the wolf pack emerging from the forest behind the cold woman, could see Taha Aki's massive black form leading the charge. But she could also see that they would be too late, that the cold woman would reach her and kill her before the wolves could intervene. The mathematics of distance and speed were undeniable. Behind her, deeper in the village, children played near a fire. Elders sat together sharing stories. The vulnerable, the ones who needed protection, the ones who could not fight, could not run, could not defend themselves against something like this. The third wife made her choice in the space of a single breath. She pulled the knife from her belt, the blade she used for cutting meat and preparing food, and she drew it across her own arm. Deep, deeper than any accidental cut. Deep enough that blood flowed immediately, hot and red and impossibly fragrant to a creature whose entire existence centered on the scent of human blood. The cold woman stopped, froze, her perfect face twisted with hunger so intense it was almost pain. Fresh blood, freely flowing, the smell of it overwhelming, intoxicating, impossible to ignore. The third wife held her bleeding arm out, offering it, drawing the vampire's attention completely to herself and away from everything else. The cold woman's focus narrowed to a single point. She forgot the wolves, forgot strategy, forgot everything except the blood. She moved toward the third wife with single-minded intensity, hands reaching, teeth bared. And in that moment of distraction, of absolute focus on one target, the wolf pack closed the distance. Taha Aki reached them first, his massive jaws closing around the cold woman's throat, tearing, ripping, using every ounce of his strength and rage and desperation. The other wolves piled on, attacking from all sides, teeth and claws finding purchase, working together with perfect coordination to tear the vampire apart. The cold woman's scream was inhuman, was the sound of something that should not be capable of making sound. She fought back with renewed fury, no longer playing, no longer amused, finally understanding that these wolves could actually destroy her. But it was too late. The pack had her surrounded, had her overwhelmed, and they tore her to pieces with savage efficiency. Even torn apart, the vampire part still moved, still tried to reassemble, still represented danger. The wolves had to burn the pieces, had to build a fire and feed every fragment to the flames until nothing remained but ash that blew away on the wind. It was the only way to ensure she was truly dead, truly gone, truly no longer a threat. But the victory was hollow. The third wife lay on the ground, her life bleeding out through the wound she had carved into her own flesh. Taha Aki transformed back to human form, gathered her into his arms, pressed his hands against the cut, trying desperately to stop the bleeding. But it was too late. She had cut too deep, had sacrificed too much. Her blood soaked into the earth, and her breathing grew shallow, and her eyes began to dim. She smiled at him, this woman who'd chosen to die so that others might live. She touched his face with a hand that was already growing cold, and she whispered that she loved him, loved the tribe, that she was not afraid. And then she died in his arms, her sacrifice complete, her choice made and accepted and final. The tribe mourned her deeply. They honored her in death as they had honored her in life, but more than that, they remembered her choice. The third wife became legend, became the story told to every generation that followed about the ultimate sacrifice, about love that transcended self-preservation, about the willingness to give everything to protect those who could not protect themselves. Her name was spoken with reverence. Her example became the standard against which all acts of courage were measured. When warriors went into battle, they carried the memory of the third wife who faced a monster with nothing but a knife and her own willingness to bleed. When mothers protected their children, they channeled the spirit of the woman who had chosen death so that others might live. And the wolves learned something crucial that night, something that would define their purpose for all the generations to come. They learned what vampires were, these cold ones who looked like humans but were something else entirely, something dead and walking and hungry. They learned that vampires were faster and stronger than almost anything, that fighting them was difficult and dangerous, that defeating one required coordination and sacrifice and absolute commitment. But most importantly, they learned that vampires were their purpose. This was why the wolf gift existed. This was why Taha Aki had been transformed, why his sons carried the potential for the wolf in their blood, why the protectors would always rise when needed. The wolves existed to fight vampires, to stand between these predators and the vulnerable humans who had no defense against such creatures. The Cold Woman had been their introduction to their true purpose, and the third wife had shown them what that purpose might cost. Protection was not abstract. It was not a concept or an ideal. It was blood and sacrifice, and the willingness to die so that others did not have to. Taha Aki never took another wife. He led the tribe for many more years, growing slowly older, training new generations of wolves, making sure the story of the Cold Woman and the third wife was never forgotten. And when he finally died, truly ancient now, the legend was secure. His children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren carried the wolf gene forward, carried the knowledge forward, carried the sacred duty forward. The protectors would always rise when vampires came near. The transformation would always occur when it was needed, and the memory of the third wife would always remind them why the sacrifice was worth it, why the burden was necessary, why they fought. The wolf gift moved through the generations like a river through stone, sometimes visible on the surface, sometimes hidden deep below where only those who knew where to look could find it. It passed from father to son, to grandson, to great-grandson, carried in blood and bone and the mysterious mathematics of genetics that no one in those ancient times could understand or explain. The gift was selective, choosing some and passing over others according to patterns that seemed random but perhaps were not, perhaps followed logic that existed beyond human comprehension. After Taha Aki's death, leadership passed to his eldest son, who carried the wolf gene, who could transform when needed, who had learned from his father the weight of responsibility and the necessity of vigilance. The new chief led well, maintained the traditions, kept the stories alive, trained the younger wolves in control and purpose. The pack during his time numbered five young men who could shift between human and wolf, who patrolled the territory, who kept watch for threats that might emerge from the forest or the sea. But no vampires came. Years passed, then decades, and the Cold One stayed away from Quileute lands. Perhaps word had spread somehow through whatever networks vampires used to communicate that this small territory was defended by creatures capable of killing them. Perhaps the death of the Cold Woman had served as warning. Perhaps it was simply chance, the random fortune of geography and circumstance. Whatever the reason, the vampires did not return, and slowly, gradually, the wolf gene began to sleep. The transformation was not automatic, not constant. It was triggered by necessity, by proximity to vampires, by the presence of the very threat the wolves existed to combat. Without vampires near, without that supernatural danger activating the genetic switch, the gift remained dormant. Men who carried the potential for the wolf in their bloodline lived normal human lives, aged normally, died normally, never knowing what they might have become if circumstances had demanded it. The pack dissolved, not through death or abandonment, but through simple lack of need. The wolves stopped phasing, stopped patrolling, returned to being fully human. They married, had children, grew old watching grandchildren play. The wolf became memory rather than present reality, became something they had been rather than something they were. And eventually they died, as all humans must. Their time as protectors finished, their service complete. Their children carried the gene forward, unknowing. The potential slept in bloodlines that went about ordinary existence, fishing and hunting and building and living. Generations passed where no one transformed, where no one needed to transform, where the wolf was legend only, story told around fires, history that felt more myth than fact. But the legends were kept alive with careful devotion. The elders made certain of that, even when no rules walked, even when the gift slept quiet in the blood. The stories of Taha Aki and the Cold Woman and the Third Wife were told and retold. Children grew up hearing about spirit warriors and shapeshifters, about vampires and sacrifice and the sacred duty of protection. The stories were treated as history, as truth, as important knowledge that must never be lost. Some generations believed completely, accepted the legends as fact, taught their children with conviction that these things had truly happened. Other generations were more skeptical, thought perhaps the stories were metaphor or exaggeration, were the way ancient peoples explained natural phenomena they did not understand. But even the skeptics told the stories, passed them down, maintained the oral tradition, because that was what you did. That was how culture survived, whether you believed every word or not. And then, perhaps 50 years after the last wolf had died, perhaps 70, a vampire would venture too close to Quileute territory, not attacking necessarily, perhaps just passing through, perhaps hunting animals in the deep forest, perhaps completely unaware that this land was claimed and defended, but their presence was enough. The proximity of a cold one, that supernatural predator, would trigger the genetic response in someone of the bloodline. A young man would wake one morning feeling strange, feeling feverish, his temperature climbing to impossible heights. He would shake, would feel his bones ache, would experience the terrifying sensation of his body preparing to become something else. And then, usually when emotion peaked, when fear or anger surged, the transformation would take him. Sudden and violent and complete, his human form would disappear, and in its place would stand a massive wolf, confused and terrified and powerful beyond measure. The first transformation was always the worst, always alone, always unexpected, always accompanied by the absolute terror of losing yourself, of becoming something you did not understand, of feeling your mind reshape along with your body. The young man would panic, would run, would try desperately to become human again, but not know how, not understand the mechanism of control that would let him shift back. Eventually, hours or days later, exhausted and desperate, he would manage the reverse transformation, would find himself human again, naked and lost in the forest, miles from home, with only fragmented memories of what had happened. He would return to the village confused, frightened, wondering if he was going mad, if he was sick, if he was cursed. And then the elders would see the signs, would notice the sudden height, the temperature that ran hot enough to be felt from feet away, the subtle changes in temperament and physicality. They would recognize what was happening because the stories had prepared them, because the legends had told them what to look for. And they would take the young man aside and explain the truth. You are a wolf. You are a shapeshifter. You are a protector, descended from Taha Aki, carrying the gift that has slept in your blood until this moment. You are not sick, and you are not cursed. You are what you were always meant to be when the threat returned. The young man would not believe, not at first. How could he? The stories were legends, were ancient history, were things that happened long ago to other people, not things that happen now to him. But the evidence was undeniable. The temperature that would not drop, the strength that let him break things accidentally, the way he could feel the forest differently now, could sense things he had never sensed before. And eventually, with guidance, he would transform again, this time with someone watching, someone who understood, someone who could help him learn control. And if he was lucky, he would not be alone for long. Usually, the presence of vampires that had triggered one transformation would trigger others. Other young men of the bloodline would begin phasing, would discover the wolf within themselves, would join to form a new pack. The mental connection would establish itself, that strange telepathic link that existed only in wolf form, that let pack members share thoughts and memories and coordinate with supernatural efficiency. They would train themselves, learn from the legends, practice the control that would let them shift at will, rather than only when emotion overwhelmed them. They would establish patrol patterns, learn to hunt as wolves, grow into their role as protectors, and they would watch for the vampires whose presence had triggered their transformation, would track the cold ones, would fulfill the purpose that was written in their genes. Sometimes they found the vampires and fought them, brief violent encounters in the deep forest where witnesses were impossible. Sometimes the vampires sensed the danger and fled, recognized somehow that this territory was defended by something capable of killing them. Sometimes the vampires were destroyed, torn apart and burned until nothing remained but ash. And sometimes the vampires killed wolves, because even with all their gifts, the shapeshifters were not invincible, could be caught off guard or outnumbered or simply unlucky. The young men who became wolves paid heavy prices for their gifts. They aged slowly while phasing regularly, their bodies frozen in the prime of youth as long as they continued to transform. This seemed like a blessing at first, immortality or something close to it. But it became complicated when wives grew old while husbands remained young, when children aged past their fathers, when the normal progression of life was disrupted by supernatural intervention. Some wolves eventually chose to stop phasing, to let themselves age normally, to reclaim human life at the cost of the wolf. Others could not stop, were too dedicated to the duty, too necessary for the pack's survival, and they became eternal guardians, watching generations pass while they remained unchanged. The isolation was perhaps worse than the aging issue. Being a wolf meant carrying secrets that could not be shared with most of the tribe. It meant having experiences that normal humans could not understand, could not relate to, could not even believe were real. It meant existing in two worlds simultaneously, the human world of the village and the supernatural world of vampires and shapeshifters, and never fully belonging to either. The pack became family in ways deeper than blood, because only other wolves understood. Only other shapeshifters could comprehend the burden and the gift in equal measure. And always, always, there was the violence, the knowledge that their purpose was to fight and kill, that they existed as weapons, as predators designed to hunt other predators. The wolves killed vampires, tore them apart with teeth and claws, burned the pieces until destruction was complete. And even though vampires were monsters, were dead things that preyed on humans, the act of killing still left marks on the soul, still required the wolves to access savage parts of themselves, to become creatures of violence and fury, to do things that normal humans would consider monstrous. But they did it anyway. They accepted the burden because the alternative was unacceptable. Without the wolves, vampires could hunt freely in Quileute territory, could prey on the vulnerable, could destroy the tribe that the protectors had been created to defend. The violence was necessary, the sacrifice was required, the duty was absolute. Eventually, if the pack was successful, if they eliminated or drove away the vampires that had triggered their transformation, peace would return. The cold ones would stay away from Quileute lands, would leave this territory alone, would hunt elsewhere. And slowly, gradually, the genetic trigger would release. The young men would stop phasing as frequently, would begin to age normally again, would slowly transition back toward human existence. Some would continue occasional patrols, maintaining some connection to the wolf, but the intensity would diminish. The pack would shrink as members chose human life, chose wives and children, and normal aging over the eternal vigilance of the protector. And then the last wolf would stop phasing, would let himself grow old, would die eventually as a human having served his time as guardian. The gene would return to dormancy, sleeping in bloodlines that went on with ordinary life, waiting for the next time vampires came too close, waiting for the next generation that would need to become wolves, waiting with infinite patience because the gift was eternal, even if the individual shapeshifters were not. This was the pattern. This was the cycle that repeated across centuries. Vampires approach, wolves rise, battles are fought. Vampires leave, wolves return to human life. Dormancy settles, decades pass in peace, vampires return, and the cycle begins again. Rise and sleep, transformation and dormancy, duty and rest, the eternal rhythm of protection that defined the Quileute shapeshifters across all the long generations of their existence. The tribe endured through this pattern, survived when other tribes did not, maintained their identity and territory and culture because they had guardians who rose when needed. The legends kept the knowledge alive during dormant periods, kept each generation prepared for the possibility that they might be the ones called to serve, that the wolf gene sleeping in their blood might wake and demand they become protectors. And so the centuries passed, each generation adding their stories to the legends, each pack of wolves serving their time and then fading back into humanity, each cycle of protection reinforcing the truth that the Quileutes were special, were chosen, were defended by magic and sacrifice and the fierce love that Taha Aki had felt when he first merged with that lonely wolf so long ago. The wolves rose again in the early decades of the 20th century, when the world was changing faster than it ever had before, when modernity was creeping into even the most isolated corners of the continent. The year was somewhere around 1936, though the exact date was lost to memory, considered less important than what happened. Vampires had returned to the Pacific Northwest, and with their return came the inevitable transformation of young Quileute men into massive wolves. The pack that emerged was led by a man named Ephraim Black, a direct descendant of Taha Aki, through an unbroken line of fathers and sons stretching back through the centuries. Ephraim was in his early 20s when the transformation took him, a young man who had grown up hearing the legends, who had believed them in the way you believe stories told by elders, with respect, but without expecting them to become personal reality. The fever came suddenly, the shaking started without warning, and the first transformation happened in the forest while he was hunting, his human form disappearing in an instant of pain and confusion and absolute terror. But Ephraim was strong, was intelligent, was born with the kind of natural leadership that made others follow without question. He mastered the transformation quickly, learned control faster than most, and when other young men began phasing in response to the vampire presence, Ephraim became their alpha naturally, assumed command of the pack without anyone questioning his right to lead. The pack numbered 7 at its peak, 7 massive wolves patrolling Quileute territory, keeping watch for the cold ones whose proximity had triggered their transformations. They fell into the patterns their ancestors had established, the rhythms of protection that had been passed down through legends. They ran through the forest on 4 legs, their minds linked in that strange telepathic connection that let them coordinate perfectly, and they waited for the vampires to make a mistake, to cross into Quileute land, to give the pack justification for the violence their genetics demanded. But the vampires they were tracking were different from any the legends had described. The pack discovered this slowly, through observation and careful surveillance. There was a coven, a family group of cold ones who had settled in the area, who seemed to be establishing permanent residence rather than just passing through. They had taken up residence just outside Quileute territory, close enough to trigger the transformation, but technically beyond the boundaries the tribe claimed. The vampires called themselves the Cullens. There was a leader, a blonde male who appeared to be in his 20s, but carried himself with ancient authority. His name was Carlyle, and he was a doctor, worked at a hospital in a nearby town, saved human lives with skills that seemed impossible for a vampire to possess. There was a female with caramel-colored hair who seemed to be his mate, gentle in her interactions with humans. And there were 3 younger vampires, all appearing to be teenagers, but moving with the grace and power that marked them as predators. The pack watched them, tracked their movements, prepared for the inevitable attack that would justify destroying them. But that moment did not come. Days passed, then weeks, then months, and the Cullens did not hunt humans, did not attack anyone, did not behave like vampires were supposed to behave. Instead, they seemed to hunt animals. The pack observed them taking down deer, elk, even a bear on one occasion. They drank the blood of these animals and left the carcasses where they fell. It was bizarre, was unprecedented, was so contrary to everything the wolves knew about vampires that it created confusion within the pack. Vampires were monsters. That was the fundamental truth the legends taught. Cold ones were dead things that preyed on humans, that killed without remorse. The entire purpose of being a shapeshifter rested on the assumption that vampires were irredeemable, were enemies that must be destroyed on sight. But the Cullens challenged that assumption. They were vampires, unquestionably. They had the pale stone skin, the inhuman beauty, the supernatural speed and strength. But they were not hunting humans, were not killing, were not behaving like the monsters the legends described. The pack argued about what to do. Some insisted that vampires were vampires, that the Cullens' current behavior was irrelevant, that eventually their nature would win. Others argued for continued observation, for not starting a war based on what the Cullens might do, rather than what they had done. Ephraim Black sided with caution. He was alpha, his decision was law, and he decided they would watch and wait. If the Cullens attacked a human, the pack would destroy them immediately. But until that happened, they would maintain surveillance without engaging. Months became a year. The Cullens remained in the area, continued their strange practice of drinking animal blood, continued living among humans without harming them. Carlyle worked at the hospital, actually saved human lives. The younger vampires attended school, maintained the masquerade of humanity with dedication that seemed excessive if their intention was eventually to hunt. And then Carlyle Cullen did something unprecedented. He requested a meeting with the wolf pack. The request came through indirect channels, a note left in a location the wolves patrolled. Carlyle asked for dialogue, for conversation, for the opportunity to explain himself and his family. He proposed neutral ground at the boundary line, promised to come alone and in peace. The pack debated accepting this invitation. It could be a trap, could be a strategy to eliminate the alpha. But Ephraim was curious, was willing to take calculated risks, and ultimately decided that understanding the Cullens better was worth the potential danger. The meeting took place on a grey afternoon when rain fell in steady sheets. Ephraim came in human form, accompanied by two pack members who remained at a distance. Carlyle Cullen came alone as promised, approaching the boundary line with slow, deliberate movements that suggested he understood how dangerous this situation was. They stood on opposite sides of an invisible line that neither crossed, separated by perhaps 20 feet of muddy ground. Ephraim saw a vampire, saw the predator wearing human shape, saw the creature his genetics screamed at him to destroy. But he also saw something in Carlyle's expression that looked almost like hope, like desperation, like someone who wanted very badly to be understood. Carlyle spoke first. His voice was calm, cultured, carried an accent that suggested centuries of experience. He thanked Ephraim for agreeing to meet, acknowledged the risk, promised he intended no harm. And then he began to explain. He told Ephraim that he was old, nearly 300 years of existence as a vampire, that he had been transformed in the 1600s in London during a time of plague and panic, that he had woken to immortality and hunger, to the overwhelming thirst for human blood that defined vampire existence, and that he had been horrified by what he had become. Carlyle explained that he had tried to kill himself in those early days, had attempted every method of self-destruction he could conceive, but vampires were nearly indestructible. He could not die, could not escape what he had become, and so he had been forced to find another way to exist. He had hidden himself away, had starved himself of blood, had endured agony that should have been impossible to survive. And in his desperation, he had discovered that animal blood could sustain him. Not well, not easily, but enough. Enough to keep him from having to kill humans. He had spent centuries perfecting this practice, had learned to survive on animal blood exclusively, had trained himself to resist human blood even when surrounded by it. He had become a doctor specifically to test himself, to prove that he could be around bleeding humans without losing control. And over the decades, he had found others like himself, vampires willing to try this different way of existence, who chose compassion over instinct. His family, the Cullens, all shared this philosophy. they called themselves vegetarians, a joke but also a sincere description of their choice. They drank only animal blood, lived among humans without hunting them, tried to be as close to good as vampires could manage. It was not easy, Carlyle admitted. Every moment was a struggle against their nature. But they persisted because the alternative, killing innocent people to satisfy hunger, was unacceptable. Carlyle looked at Ephraim across the rain-soaked distance and made his request. He asked for the chance to prove his family's intentions, to demonstrate through actions that they were not a threat to the Quileute people. He asked for the possibility of coexistence, of peace that would let the Cullens remain while the wolves maintained their vigilance. And he offered to bind himself and his family to rules, to accept restrictions that would give the pack assurance of human safety. Ephraim listened with the skepticism of someone raised on legends about vampire evil. Every instinct he possessed screamed that this was a trick, that vampires could not be trusted. But there was also the evidence of months of observation, of watching the Cullens live among humans without harming them, of seeing Carlyle save lives rather than take them. He asked Carlyle questions, challenged the vampire's explanations, pushed for details that would reveal inconsistency or deception. But Carlyle answered everything with patience and honesty that seemed genuine, admitted the difficulties and temptations his family faced, acknowledged that their choice was constant work rather than easy peace. And gradually, reluctantly, Ephraim began to consider that perhaps this vampire was telling the truth. The negotiation took hours, took multiple meetings actually, stretched over weeks as Ephraim consulted with his pack and with the tribal elders. A treaty with vampires, an agreement that would let Cold Ones exist near Quileute land without being destroyed. It went against everything the legends taught, everything the wolf gene existed to enforce. But the practical advantages were significant. If the Cullens kept their word, if they truly never harmed humans, then destroying them would be murder rather than protection. And Carlyle was offering information, was willing to share knowledge about vampires that the pack had no other way to obtain. He could teach them about vampire abilities and weaknesses, could warn them about other vampires who were genuine threats. Ephraim Black made his decision with the weight of leadership heavy on his shoulders. Knowing that this choice would echo through generations, he agreed to the treaty. The terms were simple, binding, clear enough that there could be no ambiguity. The Cullens would not harm humans. They would drink only animal blood, would never hunt people regardless of circumstance. This was absolute, was the foundation upon which everything else rested. The Cullens would not come onto Quileute land. The boundaries of the reservation were clearly defined, and crossing those boundaries would be considered an act of war, would void the treaty immediately. The Cullens would not transform any humans into vampires. The creation of new vampires was forbidden, was considered equivalent to murder. In exchange for following these rules, the Cullens would be allowed to exist in peace. The pack would not attack them, would not hunt them, would not reveal their nature to the human world. The treaty created a protected status for the Cullen family, specifically a truce that acknowledged they were different from other vampires. The treaty was sealed with ceremony, with witnesses from both sides, with the gravity appropriate to an agreement that had never been made before. Ephraim Black and Carlyle Cullen stood at the boundary line and spoke the terms aloud. binding themselves and their descendants to honor these rules, creating peace where only enmity had existed before. The pack accepted the treaty with varying degrees of comfort. Some believed Ephraim had made the right choice, that the Cullens had earned this chance. Others remained deeply suspicious, believed that eventually the vampire's nature would overcome their good intentions. But Ephraim was alpha, and his word was law, and the treaty held. Years passed, then decades. The Cullens remained in the area on and off, sometimes leaving for years at a time, always returning eventually. They never broke the treaty terms, never harmed a human, never trespassed on Quileute land. They proved through consistent action that Carlisle's word was good, that this family of vampires was genuinely different. And gradually, because no threat materialized, because no vampires came beyond the Cullens who were bound by treaty, the wolf pack began to shrink. Members stopped phasing as regularly, began to age normally again, chose human life over eternal vigilance. The genetic trigger was releasing because the danger was managed, was controlled, was bound by agreement rather than requiring constant combat. Ephraim Black eventually stopped phasing entirely, let himself grow old naturally, lived a full human life and died in his 70s, surrounded by grandchildren who carried the wolf gene dormant in their blood. The pack dissolved completely, the last wolf returning to humanity, and peace settled over the Quileute lands for the first time in generations. The treaty became legend alongside the older stories, became part of the oral tradition passed down through families. Billy Black, Ephraim's son, inherited the stories and the responsibility of remembering, of making sure future generations understood both the danger of vampires and the unprecedented peace that Ephraim had negotiated. But for decades, there were no wolves. The gene slept quietly in bloodlines that went about normal modern life, and the treaty existed only in memory, a promise made generations ago that might never need to be honored again. The wolves had been sleeping for nearly 70 years when Sam Yulee transformed, the gene dormant through 2 full generations, waiting in the blood of descendants who lived normal human lives unaware of what they carried inside them. The reservation in those modern times was small and struggling, caught between tradition and the contemporary world, between cultural identity and economic survival. Young people left for college and jobs in cities returned rarely or not at all. The old ways were fading, kept alive by elders who told stories that fewer and fewer children believed. Sam Yulee was 19 years old in the summer of 2003, a young man with plans that extended beyond the borders of the reservation. He was intelligent, hard-working, had been accepted to Washington State University with a partial scholarship. His mother was proud, his friends were envious, and his future seemed bright with possibility. He was dating Leah Clearwater, the most beautiful girl on the reservation, and they talked about marriage, about building a life together, about the normal dreams that normal young people dream. And then the fever started. It began as simple illness, or what seemed like simple illness. Sam woke one morning in late August, feeling hot, feverish, his skin burning to the touch. His mother took his temperature, and the thermometer registered 43 degrees Celsius, high enough to cause brain damage, high enough that she wanted to rush him to the hospital immediately. But Sam felt strange rather than sick, felt energized rather than weak, felt like something was building inside him rather than breaking down. The fever did not break. Days passed and Sam remained burning hot, his skin radiating heat that could be felt from feet away. He began to shake, uncontrollable tremors that ran through his body like earthquakes, and he grew, suddenly and visibly, adding inches of height and pounds of muscle in a matter of days, his body reshaping itself according to genetic instructions that had been sleeping for 70 years. Sam did not understand what was happening to him. The legends were stories he had heard, tales told by Billy Black and Old Quill and the other elders, but they were history, were things that had happened long ago. The idea that he might be transforming into a wolf never occurred to him. He thought he was sick, thought perhaps he was dying. The first transformation happened in the forest behind his house, 10 days after the fever started. Sam was outside trying to clear his head when sudden rage overwhelmed him. It was not directed at anything specific, just pure fury that erupted from nowhere, consumed his thoughts, took control. And in that moment of emotional intensity, his body responded. The transformation was agony. His bones broke and reformed, his muscles tore and rebuilt. His entire physical structure rewrote itself in seconds that felt like hours. Sam screamed, or tried to scream, but the sound that emerged was not human, was the howl of something massive and wild. And then he was no longer standing on 2 legs but 4, no longer human, but wolf, massive and grey-black and absolutely terrified. He ran. Instinct took over where understanding failed, and he simply ran, crashed through the forest with speed that should have been impossible, covering miles in minutes. His mind was chaos, human thoughts tangled with wolf instincts, awareness splintering between what he had been and what he had become. He did not know how to change back, did not know if he could change back, did not know anything except fear and confusion. Hours passed before exhaustion finally forced the reverse transformation. Sam collapsed in a clearing miles from home, and his wolf body simply released him, let him become human again without understanding how or why. He lay naked and shaking in the mud, trying to process what had just happened. His body knew the truth, could feel the wolf still there beneath his skin, waiting to emerge again. Billy Black found him 3 days later. The old man came to Sam's house in his wheelchair, asked to speak with Sam privately, and when they were alone, Billy said words that changed everything. "You are a wolf. You are a shapeshifter. You are a spirit warrior descended from Taha Aki, and you have transformed because vampires have returned to our territory. This is not sickness, Sam. This is your birthright, your duty, your destiny." Billy knew because he'd been watching, had seen the signs, had recognized what was happening from legends his father Ephraim had taught him. Billy explained everything. The history, the legends, the purpose. He taught Sam about control, about how to trigger the transformation through emotional intensity, rather than being ambushed by it. He explained the pack dynamics, the alpha status, the mental connection that would exist when other wolves emerged. And he told Sam about the Cullens, about the treaty, about the vampire family that had been gone for years, but whose return would mean more transformations. Sam learned, slowly and painfully. He practiced transforming, learned to shift between forms at will. He discovered that in wolf form his senses were impossibly acute, could hear heartbeats from hundreds of feet away, could smell individual people by their unique scent, could see in darkness that would blind human eyes, He was stronger than any human, faster than any natural wolf, powerful in ways that felt godlike and terrifying in equal measure. But he was also alone, completely, profoundly alone in a way that normal humans could never understand. He could not share this with anyone except Billy, could not explain to Leah why he was withdrawing, could not tell his mother why he was different. The isolation was crushing, was the worst part of being a wolf. And then, 6 months after Sam's first transformation, Jared Cameron phased for the first time. Jared was 16, a normal kid who played basketball and struggled with algebra and had never suspected he carried the wolf gene. But the genetic trigger had activated, and Jared woke one morning with the same fever, the same shaking, the same terrifying changes that Sam had experienced. Sam was there for Jared's first transformation, was able to guide him through it, to explain immediately what was happening. And when Jared first phased and discovered the mental connection that linked pack members in wolf form, when he felt Sam's thoughts merge with his own and understood that he was not alone, the relief was profound for both of them. The pack bond was unlike anything Sam had imagined. In wolf form, he and Jared shared thoughts completely, could communicate instantly without words, could feel each other's emotions and see each other's memories. There was no privacy, no secrets, no barriers between them. Everything Sam thought, Jared could hear. Everything Jared felt, Sam experienced. It was invasive and intimate and overwhelming, but it also meant that Sam was no longer alone. They patrolled together, two massive wolves running through the forests, coordinating through the pack mind with efficiency that seemed almost magical. The loneliness that had consumed Sam began to ease, replaced by the strange comfort of the pack bond. Paul Lahote phased 3 months later, and the dynamic shifted dramatically. Paul was 17, volatile, had always been quick to anger and quicker to fight. The wolf transformation amplified these traits, made him aggressive and difficult to control. His thoughts in the pack mind were often violent, hostile, challenging Sam's authority as alpha. Paul didn't want to be a wolf, resented the transformation, resented everything about the situation he'd been forced into. But the pack bond held them together despite Paul's aggression. Sam was alpha. His word was law according to genetics and ancient magic. And Paul could not disobey direct orders even when he wanted to. The alpha command was absolute, was a biological imperative written into the wolf gene. The reservation began to notice changes in these young men. The sudden growth spurts, the impossibly high body temperatures, the way they moved with new grace and power. Parents worried, teachers expressed concern, but no one guessed the truth because the truth was impossible. Only the elders knew, and they kept the secret, protected the pack through silence and misdirection. Sam's relationship with Leah Clearwater became serious as the years passed. They talked about marriage, about a future together, about building a life on the reservation. Leah knew something was different about Sam, could sense the changes in him, even though he could not explain them. But she loved him, trusted him, believed that whatever secrets he was keeping were kept for good reason. They got engaged when Sam was 21 and Leah was 20, planning a wedding for the following summer. And then Sam met Emily Young, and everything shattered. Emily was Leah's cousin, came to visit the reservation for 2 weeks, and Sam saw her at a family gathering he attended as Leah's fiancée. He saw her and the world stopped. Gravity shifted. The earth released him, and Emily became the center, became the sun, became everything. The imprint hit like lightning, like fate, like the universe declaring that every choice he had made until this moment was wrong, that Emily Young was his destiny and nothing else mattered. Imprinting was the wolf gene's cruelest gift, the biological imperative that transcended choice, or will or promises made. When a wolf imprinted, when they saw their perfect match, the bond was absolute and involuntary. Sam could not choose not to imprint on Emily any more than he could choose not to breathe. It simply was, simply happened. And every feeling he had ever had for Leah disappeared like smoke, replaced by devotion to Emily so intense it felt like dying and being reborn simultaneously. The guilt was crushing. Sam loved Emily, could not help loving Emily, but he also knew what this meant for Leah. He was about to destroy the woman he had promised to marry, was about to break her heart in the most brutal way possible. He tried to fight the imprint, tried to stay away from Emily, tried to honor his commitment to Leah. But the pull was too strong. Within days, Sam had broken off his engagement to Leah and confessed everything to Emily, including the truth about being a wolf. Leah's devastation was total. The girl who had been planning her wedding was suddenly abandoned by her fiancé for her own cousin, with no explanation that made sense, no closure that brought understanding. She became bitter, heartbroken, consumed by rage and grief in equal measure, and that intense emotion, that overwhelming fury and pain, triggered her own transformation. Leah Clearwater phased for the first time in a storm of anguish, becoming the first female wolf in the history of the Quileute protectors. Her wolf form was grey and smaller than the male wolves, but fast, impossibly fast, and filled with fury that made her dangerous despite her size. And when she joined the pack mind, when her thoughts merged with Sam's and Jared's and Paul's, everyone felt her pain, experienced her heartbreak, lived through her betrayal from the inside. Sam's guilt intensified exponentially. In wolf form, Leah could see his every thought about Emily, could feel the depth of his imprinting, could experience the love he felt for her cousin. There was no privacy, no escape from the constant reminder that Sam had chosen Emily, or rather, that biology had chosen Emily for him. The pack mind that had been a comfort became a torture chamber for both of them. The pack grew to 5 when Embricol phased, then 6 when Quileute joined. Each new member eased the burden of patrol duties, but added complexity to the pack dynamics. More personalities forced into intimate mental connection, more secrets revealed, more conflicts that had to be navigated. Sam tried to be a good alpha, to lead with fairness and strength, to protect not just the reservation but also the young men and women who had been forced into this life. He set patrol schedules, trained the newer wolves, maintained the treaty boundaries, watched constantly for vampires who might cross the line. And through it all, he loved Emily with the absolute devotion of an imprinted wolf. She accepted him, accepted what he was, accepted the pack and the duty and the burden. But the relationship was marked by tragedy, by the accident that happened one morning when Sam lost control during an argument. He was human when it happened, standing in Emily's kitchen, when anger rising triggered a partial transformation. His hand became a claw for just a second, just one instant, and Emily was standing too close. The claws raked across her face, 3 parallel lines from her hairline down to her chin, tearing skin and muscle, destroying the right side of her beautiful face. Sam transformed back immediately, horror overwhelming every other emotion. But the damage was done. Emily's screams brought the pack running, and they rushed her to the hospital where doctors saved her life but could not repair the scarring that would mark her forever. Sam's guilt over Leah was nothing compared to the guilt over Emily. He had scarred his imprint, had marked the woman he loved more than life itself. Emily forgave him, told him she understood, said she did not blame him. But Sam blamed himself, would always blame himself, would carry that moment of lost control for the rest of his life. The pack became Sam's purpose, his redemption, his way of channeling the violence that lived inside him towards something protective rather than destructive. He led patrols with dedication that bordered on obsession, watched the treaty line with constant vigilance, prepared the pack for threats that he hoped would never materialize. They were ready when the Cullens returned to Forks after years of absence, ready to enforce the treaty if necessary, ready to protect their people from any danger that emerged. The wolves had woken again, and this time they would not sleep until the threat was eliminated, until duty was fulfilled and the reservation was safe once more. The Cullens returned to Forks in 2005, after decades of absence, and their return triggered a cascade of transformations that expanded the pack faster than anyone had anticipated. Sam Yuli's small group of 5 wolves suddenly faced the reality that more young men would be pulled from normal life, that the genetic trigger was responding to the increased vampire presence with aggressive efficiency. The sleepy reservation that had maintained peace for 70 years was about to become a battleground, and the wolves who rose to meet this challenge would be younger, angrier, and less prepared than any pack in Quileute history. Jacob Black was 15 years old when the transformation took him, stealing his childhood in a single violent moment of fever and rage. He was Billy Black's son, carried the alpha bloodline directly from Ephraim Black through his father, though no one had explained this to him because no one expected the wolves to rise again in his generation. Jacob had grown up hearing the legends, had told some of them himself to Bella Swan during her first visit to La Push, treating them as interesting stories rather than personal destiny. He knew about the treaty, knew about the Cullens, knew the history in the abstract way, things that happened to other people in other times. But then the Cullens returned to Forks, and Jacob's body responded to their proximity with the inevitability of genetics. The fever came first, sudden and overwhelming, his temperature spiking to levels that should have been fatal. Then the shaking started, tremors that ran through his frame like earthquakes, impossible to control or suppress. His body began changing rapidly, adding height and muscle mass in days, reshaping itself according to ancient instructions. And finally, when emotion peaked during an argument with his father about going to the hospital, Jacob exploded into his wolf form for the first time. The transformation was terrifying beyond anything Jacob's young mind could process. One moment he was human, standing in his living room shouting at Billy. The next moment he was a massive russet brown wolf, easily as large as a horse, his human consciousness trapped inside an animal body that moved according to instincts he did not understand. He crashed through the front door, splintering wood, and ran into the forest in pure panic, his thoughts incoherent, his control non-existent. Sam found him within hours, tracked him through the pack sense that connected all wolves. Sam's calm presence in the pack mind helped Jacob understand what had happened, helped him process the impossible reality that the legends were true, that he was a shapeshifter, that his life had just changed irrevocably. The mental connection between them was jarring at first, invasive. Every thought Jacob had immediately available to Sam and vice versa. But it also provided comfort, provided understanding, provided the knowledge that Jacob was not alone in this terrifying new existence. Billy explained the rest once Jacob had gained enough control to shift back to human form. The Alpha bloodline, the heritage from Ephraim Black, the responsibility that came with carrying the chief's genetics. Jacob did not want any of it. Wanted to be a normal 15-year-old working on cars and hanging out with friends, not a supernatural warrior bound to ancient duty. But want was irrelevant, had been irrelevant from the moment the wolf gene activated in his blood. Jacob's best friend, Embry Cool, had already phased several months earlier, was already part of Sam's pack, though he had not been allowed to tell Jacob the truth before Jacob's own transformation. The reunion in wolf form was strange, seeing Embry's thoughts laid bare, understanding now why his friend had been distant and secretive. The pack mind connected them more deeply than friendship ever could, binding them together in ways that transcended normal human relationships. Quileute the Fifth was the last of Jacob's close friend group to transform, and his phasing came later than the others, delayed by genetics or chance, or the mysterious timing that governed these things. Quill was Jacob's other best friend, and he phased shortly before his 16th birthday, completing the trio of friends who had grown up together and would now serve together as wolves. The pack that had started with Sam's lonely transformation now numbered eight massive wolves patrolling the reservation borders, keeping watch over a treaty that was being tested in ways Ephraim Black could never have anticipated. Because the Cullens had brought danger with them, had attracted attention from other vampires, had made the Olympic Peninsula a focal point for supernatural activity. A vampire named Laurent came first, a dark-skinned cold one with long black hair who had been part of a different coven, who wandered onto Quileute land either through ignorance or arrogance. The pack intercepted him at the treaty line, and Laurent made the fatal mistake of trying to defend his trespassing, of suggesting the treaty was old and irrelevant, of implying he could do as he pleased. The pack destroyed him with brutal efficiency, 5 wolves attacking in coordinated fury, tearing the vampire apart before he could escape or call for help. It was the first vampire kill in 70 years, the first time the modern pack had fulfilled their purpose as protectors, and the violence of it marked them all. They burned the pieces as the legends instructed, reduced Laurent to ash that scattered on the wind, and learned viscerally what it meant to be killers, to be weapons, to do violence in service of protection. But Laurent had been a scout, had been testing the area on behalf of another vampire. Her name was Victoria, and she was something far more dangerous than Laurent, far more cunning and vengeful. Victoria was hunting for Bella Swan, the human girl who lived in Forks, who was in a relationship with Edward Cullen, who had been involved in the death of Victoria's mate James a year earlier. Victoria wanted revenge, wanted to kill Bella as payment for James's death, and she was willing to be patient, willing to be strategic, willing to spend months or years creating opportunities. The pack detected Victoria's presence through scent trails along the treaty line, through brief sightings of red hair flashing between trees, through the instinctive knowledge that something dangerous was circling their territory looking for weakness. She never crossed onto Quileute land, was too intelligent to give them justification for attacking, but she was always there, always watching, always waiting. And Jacob Black, young and angry and full of protective instincts he barely understood, became obsessed with protecting Bella Swan from this threat. Bella had been Jacob's friend since childhood, though they had not been close during her years living in Phoenix with her mother. But when Bella moved to Forks to live with Charlie permanently, when she started spending time at La Push, the friendship rekindled and deepened. Jacob had been there for Bella during the dark months after Edward Cullen left her, after the Cullens moved away and Bella sank into depression so profound she was barely functional. Jacob had pulled her out of that darkness, had made her laugh again, had given her reasons to keep living when she seemed intent on fading away entirely. And somewhere during those months of friendship, somewhere between rebuilding motorcycles together and walking on the beach and talking for hours about everything and nothing, Jacob had fallen in love with Bella, deeply, completely, with the intensity that 15-year-old boys feel everything, amplified by wolf instincts that made all emotions sharper and stronger. He loved her before he phased, and after transformation, the love only intensified, became a driving force in his life, became the thing he thought about constantly whether he wanted to or not. The pack knew, of course, in wolf form. There was no hiding emotions or thoughts from pack brothers. Sam knew Jacob loved Bella. Paul knew. Jared and Embry and Quill and Leah all knew. Could feel Jacob's feelings as if they were their own. Could see every memory he had of her, every hope for a future together. The lack of privacy was torture, especially when the pack had opinions about Jacob's attachment to the human girl who loved a vampire, because Bella had chosen Edward Cullen, had chosen the vampire over Jacob, had chosen coldstone skin over warm human flesh, had chosen immortality over the normal life Jacob could offer her. The Cullens returned to Forks in late 2006, and Bella immediately reconciled with Edward, forgave him for leaving, dove back into their relationship with the intensity of someone who had been starving and finally found food. And Jacob, watching from the reservation border, felt his heart break in ways that made Leah's heartbreak seem almost mild in comparison. The treaty prevented Jacob from interfering directly. He could not cross onto Cullen territory to confront Edward, could not attack the vampire who had stolen the girl Jacob loved, could not do anything except watch from a distance and feel rage and grief and helpless longing. The pack tried to be understanding, tried to give Jacob space to process his feelings, but in the pack mind there was no space, no privacy. Everyone feeling his pain constantly, living through his heartbreak every time they phased together. Bella tried to maintain her friendship with Jacob despite the complications. She came to La Push when she could, spent time with him on the beach or at his garage, clearly valued his companionship even though her heart belonged to Edward. But the treaty made things difficult, made it impossible for Jacob to be near Edward without his wolf instincts screaming at him to attack, without the genetic imperative to destroy vampires overwhelming his conscious desire to maintain peace. They could not be in the same room together, could not occupy the same spaces, and so Bella's time was divided between Forks with Edward and La Push with Jacob, between her vampire boyfriend and her werewolf best friend. The situation became critical when Victoria's stalking escalated into active threat. The vampire was spotted more frequently, was clearly planning something, was coordinating with other vampires to create a strategy that would overwhelm the Cullens' defenses. And then intelligence came that Victoria was creating an army of newborn vampires in Seattle, was transforming humans into cold ones by the dozens, was building a force specifically designed to attack Forks and kill Bella Swan. Newborn vampires were explained to the pack by Sam, who had learned about them from Billy, who had learned from Ephraim's stories. Newly transformed vampires were stronger than older ones, were driven entirely by bloodlust, were violent and uncontrollable and nearly impossible to reason with. An army of them, even a small army, represented danger that the Cullens might not be able to face alone. And if the newborns reached Forks, if they rampaged through the town hunting for Bella, humans would die, the Cullens would be exposed, and the Volturi, the vampire royalty who enforced the laws of secrecy, would come to eliminate everyone involved. The pack faced an impossible decision. The treaty bound them to stay separate from the Cullens, to maintain the boundaries that Ephraim had established. But if the newborn army attacked Forks, the reservation would be at risk. Quileute people could be caught in the violence, and the pack's entire purpose was protecting the tribe from vampire threats. Logic suggested cooperation with the Cullens, a temporary alliance against the common enemy. But instinct screamed that vampires were enemies, that working with cold ones was betrayal of everything the wolf gene represented. Sam called for a meeting with Carlisle Cullen at the treaty line, the first formal meeting between the pack and the Cullens since the treaty was created. It was tense, both sides approaching with warriors ready for violence, the scent of vampire and wolf, making everyone's instincts scream. But Carlisle was diplomatic, was understanding, explained the situation with honesty that even the most suspicious pack members had to respect. Victoria was creating the newborn army specifically to get to Bella. The attack would come within weeks. The Cullens were preparing their defense, but were outnumbered potentially 3-1, or worse. If the pack would agree to fight alongside them, the combined force might be enough to survive. The pack debated internally, Sam polling each member through the pack mind, hearing arguments for and against alliance. Paul was violently opposed. His hatred of vampires absolute, his belief that they should let the Cullens and newborns destroy each other and then eliminate whoever survived. Lear argued for protecting the tribe first, for not risking wolves in a battle that was fundamentally about vampire politics. But Jacob argued passionately for helping, for protecting Bella, even if she had chosen Edward, for doing whatever was necessary to keep her alive. Sam made the decision as alpha, his word final and binding. They would ally with the Cullens against the newborn army. The treaty would be temporarily expanded to allow for coordination and cooperation during the battle. But once the threat was eliminated, the original terms would be restored, and the wolves and vampires would return to their separate territories. The training that followed was surreal. Wolves and vampires working together despite every instinct screaming that they were enemies. Jasper Cullen, who had experience with newborn armies from his past, taught both groups how to fight the young vampires, how to use their superior numbers and coordination to overcome the newborns' raw strength. the wolves learned that newborns fought wildly, relied on power over strategy, could be defeated if you stayed calm and worked together. And the Cullens learned about the pack mind, about how the wolves coordinated through shared consciousness, about the advantages of fighting as a unified force. Seth Clearwater phased during the training period, Leah's younger brother transforming at the impossibly young age of 15. Seth was the youngest wolf in the pack's history, was enthusiastic and optimistic in ways that seemed impossible given the burden he had just accepted. But Seth adapted quickly, embraced his role as protector with joy rather than resentment, and somehow, impossibly, Seth liked the Cullens. He thought Edward was interesting, thought Alice was funny, thought Carlisle was wise. The pack found his attitude bizarre, but Seth's positivity was infectious, made the training sessions less tense, built bridges between wolves and vampires that should not have been possible. Jacob's role in the coming battle was decided by strategy rather than desire. He and Seth would guard Bella directly, would take her to a location far from the main battlefield, where she would be hidden from Victoria's senses. Edward would stay with them, unable to leave Bella unprotected, and together they would form a small unit separate from the main force. It was logical, made tactical sense, protected the target that Victoria was actually hunting. But it also meant Jacob would spend the battle with Edward, with the vampire he hated most in the world, forced to cooperate to keep Bella alive. The night before the battle, Jacob went to see Bella one last time. She was at her house in Forks, preparing mentally for the violence she knew was coming. Jacob stood in her yard and called up to her window, and she came down to talk to him, wrapped in a jacket against the cold that he could not feel. They talked about nothing important, about everything important, about the past and the potential lack of future. And Jacob, desperate and knowing this might be his last chance, told Bella he loved her, told her that he had always loved her, that he would always love her, that she was choosing wrong by picking Edward over him. Bella did not know what to say. She loved Jacob, but not the way he wanted, not the way he needed. She loved him as a friend, as someone who had saved her when she was drowning, as someone she could not imagine life without. But her heart belonged to Edward, had always belonged to Edward, and no amount of wanting to feel differently would change that fundamental truth. She tried to explain this gently, tried to soften the rejection, but there was no kind way to break someone's heart. Jacob walked away from that conversation knowing he had lost, knowing that even if they all survived the coming battle, even if Victoria was destroyed and the newborns were defeated, Bella would never be his. The grief was crushing, was made worse by the knowledge that tomorrow he would have to fight alongside Edward, would have to protect the vampire who had everything Jacob wanted, would have to ensure that Bella and Edward got their happy ending, even though it destroyed his own. The battle came on a cold morning in early June, when clouds hung low over the mountains and the forest seemed to hold its breath. The newborn army was 20 strong, 20 young vampires driven by bloodlust and Victoria's promises of violence. They came crashing through the forest toward the clearing where the Cullens waited, and the pack intercepted them with coordinated fury, massive wolves tearing into stone flesh, working together with supernatural efficiency. The Cullens fought alongside the wolves as planned, vampire speed and precision combining with wolf strength and pack tactics. Jasper directed strategy through Edward, who could hear both vampire and wolf thoughts, coordinating the forces despite the chaos. The newborns were strong but wild, were easy to outmaneuver, were defeated one by one as the alliance held firm. On the mountain where Bella hid, Jacob and Seth stood guard while Edward kept watch. The three of them bound together by shared purpose despite their fundamental incompatibility. And Victoria came, as they had known she would, drawn to Bella's scent, driven by the need for revenge that had consumed her for over a year. She was fast, was cunning, had survived centuries by being smarter than other vampires. But she had not anticipated Seth's speed, or Jacob's size, or Edward's ability to read her thoughts and predict her movements. The three of them worked together, and Victoria's centuries of survival ended in the mountain clearing. Her body torn apart and burned until nothing remained. The Volturi came afterward, vampire royalty arriving to judge whether the laws of secrecy had been maintained, whether the battle had drawn too much human attention. But the clearing was remote, the witnesses were non-existent, and the Cullens could demonstrate that they had acted in self-defense against an illegal newborn army. The Volturi left satisfied, and the alliance between wolves and vampires dissolved as quickly as it had formed. The pack returned to the reservation, returned to patrols and boundaries and the careful separation the treaty demanded. But something had changed. They had fought beside the Cullens, had seen that some vampires could be trusted, had proven that cooperation was possible when necessity demanded it. The absolute certainty that all vampires were evil had been challenged, had been complicated by experience that contradicted legend. Jacob returned to his heartbreak, to the knowledge that Bella had chosen Edward permanently. She married the vampire that summer, a human wedding that Jacob could not attend without violating the treaty. And shortly after, Bella was transformed, became a vampire herself, became the thing Jacob had begged her not to become. The girl he loved was gone, replaced by a cold one with Bella's face and Bella's memories, but no longer human, no longer warm, no longer the person Jacob had fallen in love with. The grief nearly destroyed him. Jacob stopped phasing for a while, left the pack, ran as a wolf alone in the wilderness, trying to outrun the pain that followed him everywhere. Leah came with him, understanding his heartbreak in ways no one else could. Two broken hearts running together through the endless forest. Eventually they returned, duty calling them back, but Jacob was changed, was harder, carried scars that no amount of time would fully heal. The wolves had survived their greatest test, had faced the newborn army and Victoria's revenge, and emerged victorious. But the cost had been measured in heartbreak and lost innocence, in the understanding that protecting people you loved sometimes meant watching them make choices that destroyed you, and all you could do was keep them safe anyway, even when safety meant losing them forever. Bella Swan married Edward Cullen in August of 2006, a wedding that should have been the end of Jacob Black's hope, but instead became the beginning of something far more complicated. The pack watched from the reservation borders as the Cullens celebrated, as Bella committed herself to immortality, as the future Jacob had dreamed of disappeared completely. The treaty prevented the wolves from attending, prevented them from being anywhere near the vampire gathering, and Jacob was grateful for that distance, because witnessing Bella's wedding would have destroyed what little composure he had left. The newlyweds left for their honeymoon, and for a few weeks the reservation settled into uneasy peace. The pack maintained their patrols, watched the Cullen house standing empty, and tried to return to the rhythms that had existed before Bella, and newborn armies and alliances with vampires had complicated everything. Jacob ran alone mostly, avoiding the pack mind when possible, not wanting to share his grief with brothers who had felt it constantly during the battle and its aftermath. But then Edward and Bella returned early from their honeymoon, and everything changed again. The call came through Carlisle, a request for Sam to meet at the treaty line, urgent and desperate in ways that made the Alpha suspicious immediately. Sam went with the full pack as backup, expecting a trap or a treaty violation, or some new threat emerging from the vampire world. What he found instead was Carlisle Cullen looking ancient, despite his eternally young face, looking worried in ways that suggested the problem was catastrophic. Bella was pregnant. The words did not make sense at first. Seemed impossible given that Bella was married to a vampire, that vampires were dead things that should not be capable of reproduction. But Carlisle explained that the pregnancy was real, that something in vampire venom had apparently allowed Edward to father a child during their honeymoon while Bella was still human, that the hybrid baby growing inside Bella was developing at an impossible rate and killing her in the process. The fetus was different from anything in vampire or human experience. It grew with supernatural speed, was strong enough that its movements inside Bella were breaking her bones, was poisoning her blood with venom that leaked through the placenta, was consuming her from the inside out. Bella was dying, would be dead within weeks, and the Cullens could not simply terminate the pregnancy because Bella refused, because she wanted this baby despite the cost, because she had bonded with the creature inside her and would rather die than destroy it. Sam listened to Carlisle's explanation with growing horror and rage. This was a violation of the treaty, he declared. The Cullens had transformed Bella into something, had created a hybrid abomination, had produced exactly the kind of supernatural threat the pack existed to eliminate. The treaty stated that the Cullens would not bite humans, would not create new vampires, and while the baby was not technically a vampire, it was close enough that Sam considered the treaty broken. And if the treaty was broken, then the Cullens were no longer protected. The pack would fulfill their duty as protectors, would eliminate the threat before it could be born, before the hybrid creature could emerge and potentially threaten the tribe. Sam ordered the pack to prepare for an attack on the Cullen house, to destroy Bella and the thing inside her, before the situation escalated further. Jacob Black refused the Alpha command. The refusal was instinctive, immediate, absolute. Jacob could not attack Bella, could not kill her even to save the tribe from a potential threat, could not fulfill a duty that required destroying the girl he loved more than his own life. The Alpha command should have been irresistible, should have forced Jacob's obedience regardless of his personal desires. But something deeper than the command, something fundamental in Jacob's genetics, allowed him to resist. Because Jacob was not just any pack member. He was the direct descendant of Ephraim Black through the male line, carried the Alpha bloodline in his blood, was the rightful heir to pack leadership according to genetics and tradition. Sam's Alpha status existed only because Jacob had never challenged it, had never claimed his birthright, had been content to let Sam lead. But now, faced with an order he could not obey, Jacob's genetics asserted themselves. He was Alpha, had always been Alpha, and Sam's command had no power over him. Jacob broke from Sam's pack in that moment, severed the connection that had bound him to the other wolves, claimed his independence through sheer force of will and genetic authority. The sensation was like tearing, like ripping away part of himself, painful and disorienting and absolute. And then he was alone in his own mind for the first time since phasing. The pack bond gone, replaced by the strange silence of individual consciousness. But he was not alone for long. Seth Clearwater followed Jacob immediately, chose friendship and conscience over pack loyalty, broke from Sam's pack to stand with Jacob. And Leah followed too, surprising everyone, including herself, choosing Jacob's tiny rebellion over Sam's larger pack, perhaps seeking escape from the constant torture of being in Sam's mind, of feeling his love for Emily every moment they were phased together. Two packs now existed where there had been one. Sam's pack, larger and more experienced, bound by traditional pack structure, and Sam's alpha authority, and Jacob's pack, tiny and new, consisting of only 3 wolves, but led by the rightful alpha heir. The division was unprecedented, was against all tradition and pack instinct, but it was real, was binding, was a fracture that would define both groups going forward. Sam's pack surrounded the Cullen house, preparing to attack, to fulfill what Sam saw as their duty to eliminate the threat. Jacob's pack positioned themselves between Sam and the Cullens, defending Bella and the baby, prepared to fight their own pack brothers to prevent the execution Sam had ordered. The standoff was tense, was seconds from erupting into violence between wolves, when Carlyle proposed a temporary truce. They would wait, would see what the baby was when it was born, would judge the threat based on reality rather than fear. If the creature was dangerous, if it threatened humans, then the pack would have justification for action. But until then, they would maintain peace. Sam agreed reluctantly, recognizing that fighting Jacob's pack would weaken both groups, would serve no purpose if the baby might be harmless. The siege continued, but without immediate violence, Sam's wolves watching from the forest, while Jacob's pack guarded the Cullen house directly. The weeks that followed were surreal. Jacob spent his days at the Cullen house, watching Bella deteriorate, watching the pregnancy consume her, watching Edward and the other Cullens struggle to keep her alive long enough to deliver the baby. Rosalie Hale, usually cold and distant with everyone, became Bella's fierce protector, the vampire who understood Bella's desire for the baby, even when no one else could, who guarded Bella with devotion that seemed almost maternal. Jacob and Rosalie formed an unlikely alliance, the werewolf and the vampire united by shared purpose. They talked during the long hours of watching over Bella, found common ground in their protectiveness, developed mutual respect despite the fact that genetically they should have been trying to kill each other. The absurdity of the situation was not lost on Jacob, that he was spending his days inside a vampire house, coordinating with Cold Ones, defending a hybrid baby from his own pack brothers. Bella grew weaker daily, her body breaking under the strain of the pregnancy. Her ribs cracked from the baby's movements, her spine fractured. She could not keep down food, could barely maintain consciousness, was dying so obviously that even her determination could not hide it. Edward begged her to terminate the pregnancy, to save herself, to let go of the baby before it killed her. But Bella refused with the stubbornness that had always defined her. insisted that she wanted this child, that she would see the pregnancy through regardless of cost. The birth came suddenly, violently, Bella's spine breaking completely under the baby's strength. The delivery was chaos, was horror, was Bella screaming and bleeding and dying while the Cullens worked frantically to save both her and the child. Jacob watched from the doorway, unable to help, unable to look away, feeling every second of Bella's agony through the invisible connection that bound them despite species and choices and everything that had come between them. And then the baby was born, and Jacob saw her for the first time. She was impossibly beautiful, even covered in blood and birth fluids, even in the midst of the chaos. She had Bella's eyes, or a version of them, brown, but somehow brighter, more aware. She had Edward's features, the bone structure that marked her as partly vampire, but softened by something human, something warm that vampires lacked. She was perfect, was tiny and fragile and absolutely perfect, and Bella held her for exactly 3 seconds before her heart stopped, before the venom that Edward injected directly into her chest began the transformation that would either save her or fail and leave her dead forever. The Cullens took the baby, cleaned her, wrapped her in blankets, while Bella's body convulsed through transformation, and Jacob, standing in the doorway, watching this tiny creature who was hours old, who was half vampire and half human and entirely unprecedented, felt the world shift. Imprinting hit like lightning, like destiny, like the universe rewriting itself around a single point. Jacob looked at the baby and gravity changed. The earth released him, and this tiny girl became the center of everything, became the sun around which his entire existence would orbit. Every feeling he had ever had for Bella disappeared instantly, was replaced by absolute devotion to this child, this perfect, innocent creature who was Bella's daughter, who was part of the girl he had loved, but also entirely herself. The imprint was different from what Sam or Jared or Paul had described. This was not romantic, not sexual, not the maid bond that usually defined imprinting. This was protective, was paternal, was the overwhelming need to keep this child safe, to ensure she grew up happy and healthy and protected from anything that might harm her. Jacob would be whatever she needed, brother or friend or protector, or eventually, if she chose when she was old enough to choose, something more. But for now, for these first moments, he was simply hers, bound to her through magic and genetics and the wolf gift that had decided this child was his purpose. The imprint changed everything. Sam's pack could feel it through the pack mind when Jacob phased, could see the bond that tied Jacob to the hybrid baby, could understand through the imprinting that she was protected now by wolf magic as ancient and binding as the gene itself. The treaty laws about imprinting were absolute. An imprinted person, regardless of what they were, became untouchable to the pack. To harm someone a wolf had imprinted on was to violate the most fundamental law of pack existence. Sam's order to destroy the baby became impossible to enforce. Jacob had imprinted, had bound himself to the child, and the pack could not attack without violating laws more ancient than the treaty with the Cullens. The siege ended, the threat dissolved, and both packs returned to an uneasy peace that now included a hybrid child under wolf protection. Bella survived her transformation, woke 3 days later as a vampire with control that shocked even Carlisle. She was a newborn but moved with grace rather than violence, could be around humans without losing control. managed her thirst with discipline that should have been impossible. And when she saw her daughter for the first time with vampire eyes, when she held Renesmee and understood that Jacob had imprinted on her baby, the complexity of emotions was almost overwhelming. Gratitude that Jacob would protect her child. Discomfort with the nature of imprinting, even though Jacob insisted it was not romantic, that he would be whatever Renesmee needed. And strange peace in knowing that Jacob's heartbreak had ended, that he had found his purpose, that all of them were bound together now in ways that transcended the divisions between vampire and human and wolf. Renesmee grew rapidly, developing at a rate that suggested she would reach maturity within 7 years rather than 18. She was intelligent, could communicate through touch, showing people her thoughts and memories directly. She drank blood, but also ate human food, was truly hybrid in ways that balanced both sides of her nature. And Jacob was there constantly, guarding her, playing with her, watching her grow with devotion that made Bella both happy and wary in equal measure. The peace lasted 3 months before the next crisis emerged. A vampire named Irina saw Renesmee from a distance, assumed she was an immortal child, a human child transformed into a vampire. Immortal children were the highest crime under Volturi law, the one violation that guaranteed death for everyone involved. Children transformed into vampires could not control their thirst, killed indiscriminately, drew human attention, threatened exposure. The Volturi had eliminated immortal children centuries ago, had made their creation punishable by execution. Irina reported the Cullens to the Volturi, and the ancient vampire royalty decided to come to Forks to judge the situation themselves. If Renesmee was truly an immortal child, the Cullens would be destroyed, along with anyone who had helped them or known about the child. That included the wolf pack, included the entire reservation, included everyone who had failed to report the crime. The Cullens gathered witnesses, vampires from around the world, who could testify that Renesmee was not an immortal child, but a hybrid. Something different, something that had never existed before. And they asked the wolf packs for help, for both Sam's pack and Jacob's pack to stand with them when the Volturi arrived, to present a united front of wolves and vampires defending Renesmee's right to exist. Both packs agreed. Sam, because the imprint bound the tribe to protect Renesmee, because pack law was absolute, because even his reservations about vampires could not override the imperative to defend what Jacob had imprinted on. And Jacob, because Renesmee was everything, was his reason for existing, was worth any sacrifice or danger. The Volturi arrived in January of 2007. Dozens of vampires dressed in black robes, led by Aro and Caius and Marcus, ancient beings who had ruled vampire kind for 3,000 years. They came to the clearing near the Cullen house, expecting to find an immortal child and justification for execution. What they found instead was an army, vampires and werewolves standing together, dozens of witnesses ready to testify, and a hybrid child who was clearly growing, clearly aging, clearly not the crime they had been told about. The confrontation lasted hours. Tense negotiations where Aro examined Renesmee directly, where witnesses testified to her uniqueness, where the Cullens argued for her right to exist. The Volturi wanted to find reason for violence, wanted to eliminate the powerful coven that had gathered so many allies, wanted to destroy the wolves who represented a threat to vampire supremacy. But the evidence was undeniable. Renesmee was not an immortal child. She was something new, something unprecedented, something that had broken no laws because no laws existed about her specific nature. Alice Cullen, who could see the future, showed Aro a vision of what would happen if the Volturi attacked, the battle that would result, the casualties on both sides, the potential for Volturi members to die. The vision was prophecy and warning in equal measure, showing Aro that victory would be costly, that some of his guard would fall, that the price of destroying the Cullens would be higher than he was willing to pay. The Volturi retreated, left without the violence they had seemed intent on, left Renesmee and the Cullens and the wolves alive, left the unprecedented alliance intact. It was victory through demonstration rather than combat, survival through evidence rather than fighting, and everyone involved understood how close they had come to a battle that would have killed many on both sides. The packs remained after the Volturi left, Sam's pack and Jacob's pack still technically divided, but functioning in cooperation. The genes remained active. The wolves continued phasing, because vampires remained in the area, because the Cullens were permanent residents now, because Renesmee existed and needed protecting. The young men who'd been pulled into this life understood that they would age slowly as long as they continued phasing, that they might serve as protectors for decades. That normal human life had become impossible the moment the wolf gene woke in their blood. Jacob settled into his role as Renesmee's guardian, watching her grow from infant to toddler to child at supernatural speed, patient with the knowledge that someday she would be old enough to choose her own path, to decide what Jacob meant to her. For now, he was content to be her protector, her friend, her constant presence in a life that was complicated by being half vampire and half human and entirely unique. The Quileute wolves had survived everything the modern world had thrown at them. Victoria's revenge, the newborn army, the split between packs, the Volturi's judgment. They had fought beside vampires, had defended a hybrid child, had proven that the ancient traditions could adapt to new realities while maintaining the core purpose that defined them. They were protectors, were guardians, were the descendants of Taha Aki, carrying on the legacy that had begun centuries ago, when a spirit warrior merged with a lonely wolf and created something that transcended both. The wolves still ran through the forests, still patrolled the borders, still served the tribe, even though that service had become more complicated than any of their ancestors could have imagined. The legends had predicted none of this, had not prepared them for alliances with vampires or imprinting on hybrid children or the fracturing of packs into competing groups. But the core remained, the fundamental truth that had always defined the Quileute shapeshifters. They protected, they sacrificed, they endured, and they would continue to do so for as long as the gene lived in their blood, for as long as threats existed, for as long as the tribe needed guardians who were more than human. And so the timeline of the Quileute wolves comes full circle, from ancient legend to modern reality, from Taha Aki's first transformation to Jacob Black's imprint on Renesmee. Centuries of protection, generations of sacrifice, bloodlines carrying the gift forward through dormancy and awakening, through peace and violence, through isolation and alliance. The wolves still run through the forests of the Pacific Northwest, still patrol the boundaries between human and supernatural, still serve as guardians for a tribe that has endured when so many others have vanished into history. The legends that once seemed like stories told by firelight have proven themselves truth, have written themselves into the bodies of young men who carry Taha Aki's legacy in their blood. The gene sleeps and wakes according to need, according to threat, according to the eternal rhythm of protection that defines the Quileute people. And when danger comes again, as it always does, the wolves will rise. They always have. They always will. So close your eyes now. Let the legends guard your dreams, and rest knowing that somewhere in the darkness, wolves are running, keeping watch, standing between the vulnerable and the night. Sleep well, dreamy travelers. The protectors have you in their care.